She's been branded as the most nefarious woman in the annals of humanity. With the demeanor and occupation akin to a perpetual abyss, Miriam SOULAKIOTIS ensnared those around her in a web of deceit for decades. Her motives? Simple: money and power. By the culmination of her reign, Miriam SOULAKIOTIS would find herself behind bars, known infamously as the nun serial killer. This isn't the script of a horror film. Regrettably, it's a grim reality. Born in 1883 in Greece to a destitute family, Miriam faced a future devoid of promise, toiling on her family's farm. Despite her humble origins, Miriam harbored grand ambitions, yearning for a life of opulence and influence. She dreamt of a life of wealth and power. Some accounts suggest Miriam eked out a living in a factory, laboring tirelessly to support her family. One can easily envision the arduous existence Miriam endured before embracing the habit. Early mornings, scant breakfasts, or perhaps no breakfast at all, depending on the household's provisions. Tending to the farm would hardly have been enjoyable for a teenage girl, and factory work offered little respite. Yet, Miriam never relinquished her resolve, her determination to carve out a formidable identity unwavering. Bereft of viable avenues for advancement, Miriam chose the path she believed would realize her aspirations. She resolved to become a nun in the mainstream Greek Orthodox Church. Matthew Karpathikis, the head monk of the Kalandaris Church, played a pivotal role in Miriam's journey. Their paths crossed when Matthew, disenchanted with the old church's teachings, contemplated establishing a new convent. He became close with Miriam as he was her religious superior. Fate intervened as Miriam aligned herself with Matthew's vision, embarking on a journey that would see the inception of the new Kalandaris Church, and Marina SOULAKIOTIS transformed into Miriam SOULAKIOTIS. Little did anyone suspect that the woman who assumed the pious moniker of Miriam would unleash havoc upon her devout followers. The future of the new Kalandaris Church appeared uncertain under Miriam's stewardship, ominous signs foreshadowing impending turmoil. Rising through the ecclesiastical ranks, Miriam earned the trust of Archbishop Matthew of Rhysthena. When Matthew clashed with the old Kalandaris Church, Miriam stood steadfastly by his side, laying the groundwork for the Panagia Pevkovanuti Monastery, or the Convent of the Virgin in the Pines, in 1927. This was between the town of Karatia and the rural village of Kakithalassa. The monastery's inauguration ostensibly celebrated the Virgin Mary's patronage, yet its true purpose was to amass funds to bolster the faltering old Kalandaris movement. Matthew had been planning to set up his own monastery for the last few years, and Miriam helped to get him access to the land. She came into an additional 7 acres of land, and later that year, she acquired 2 more plots of land. No one knows how she was able to secure so much property. There is no legal explanation as to how the nuns acquired the money to make these expensive property purchases. Both Miriam and Matthew concealed their ulterior motives adeptly, presenting themselves as paragons of honesty, integrity, and faith to their unsuspecting followers. Faith, indeed, served as the bedrock of the Kalandaris movement, yet its proponents' devotion proved insufficient to avert catastrophe. Miriam's faith mirrored that of her flock, yet she resorted to violence, extortion, and blackmail, betraying the very principles she purported to uphold. Erecting a monastery from scratch posed considerable challenges, especially with limited resources. The seemingly miraculous construction of the monastery prompted questions about its financing, unearthing a macabre truth lurking beneath the surface. Marketed as a sanctuary for tuberculosis sufferers, the Convent of the Virgin in Pine attracted throngs of desperate individuals seeking refuge. The Convent of the Virgin in Pine was advertised as a healing center for tuberculosis, or TB. The monastery was built at a high altitude, and since there wasn't a cure for TB at the time, people who did not have the means to get medical treatment came to the monastery as a safe haven. People started to come to the monastery in throngs so they could heal themselves, and Miriam welcomed them with pleasure. Despite the absence of medical facilities, people flocked to the monastery, lured by the promise of healing within the fold of this burgeoning sect. Maryam would cram multiple patients into a single room, refusing doctors access unless they signed death certificates. This reckless practice might have gone unnoticed had Maryam not embarked on yet another gruesome endeavor within her monastery. Meanwhile, she reveled in the limelight of the new Calandaris church. While Archbishop Matthew, already aging when the monastery was built, reached 66 as Maryam flourished in her youth. Observing Matthew's leadership closely, Maryam assumed responsibilities during his imprisonment, later witnessing his spiritual pursuits as a high-ranking monk. He would do 40-day fasts and stay in isolation to get close to God. While Matthew was going through his spiritual journey with heavy metal chains tied around his waist, his apprentice decided to put others under duress. When Matthew was on his deathbed, Archbishop Metropolitan Chrysostomos of Florina came to visit him. The archbishop wanted to bury the hatchet and possibly end the division in the Calandaris church. Before Matthew could try to say anything to Chrysostomos, Maryam barged into the room with all the nuns and told him to leave. We can only speculate how the healing of the division would have come about. We can never know what kind of effects it would have had on the future of the Calandaris church, as Maryam had snuffed out all hope for an agreement. However, as Matthew's health waned, Maryam gradually assumed control, ultimately becoming abbess. This was in the year 1950. After waiting for 11 years, Maryam was finally given the title of Mother of Maryam of Kurti. Her lifelong ambition of gaining control was complete. She was the abbot of the monastery. She would wear the Greek-style cloth head covering, a black veil that covered her forehead and eyebrows. This piece of clerical clothing was only worn by high-ranking Eastern Orthodox nuns. She had decided to gather as much wealth as she could. She did not care what method she had to use to get the job done. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when Maryam descended into murderous wrath. However, it is evident that she started her ascetic practices soon after she became an abbess. Her strong character had evolved into a formidable force. She wanted to amass as much wealth for her monastery as she could. When the news of Maryam's activities was made public, she was named Mother Rasputin by the media. Donating to charity may seem like the most humane thing a person can do. But what if that donation is based on fear? That is exactly what Maryam did. Her crimes went far beyond the suspicions of illegal imports that she was first convicted of. She had destroyed a number of lives by trying to treat patients suffering from TB. With many people suffering from isolation and pain, Maryam was involved in hundreds of negligent homicides. She collected millions of dollars worth of property in the names of girls' dowries. She could first trap a wealthy family by promising them salvation. If they did not agree, she would tie them up in her basement and torture them until they succumbed to her wishes. She would lock people up until they died of starvation. Nobody knows exactly how many people were doomed to the fate obtained by the abbess of the monastery, but a total of 27 murders were estimated by the Greek police. Mr. and Mrs. Baca were devout followers of the Calandaris church. They were impressed by the courage shown by Archbishop Matthew and his monastery. Mrs. Baca's theological bent toward the church led her to studying with Maryam SOULAKIOTIS. Alas, she was not aware of the horrendous practices of the so-called abbess. She had already pledged her whole property to the church, but when she realized that Maryam was resorting to violence to get her way, she tried to leave with her 2 children. Maryam couldn't bear to lose such a golden opportunity and locked Mrs. Baca in a cell. Mrs. Baca was forced to live in a cell where patients with TB had died. She would wail and cry out for help, but no one could hear her pleas. Since the monastery was on top of a mountain, it proved to be the perfect dungeon for Maryam's diabolical plans. She would only allow a few mouthfuls of food to be given to the imprisoned Mrs. Baca. When Maryam decided to release Mrs. Baca, the woman was a mere shell of her former self. She fell into a coma, and Maryam did not do anything to help the woman. Instead, she let Mrs. Baca rot and die in the prison she called the monastery. Mr. Baca was also placed in isolation until he fell ill and succumbed to a lonely and painful death. Imagine visiting a monastery to get spiritual enlightenment and then coming back with nothing but an empty bank account. Unfortunately, the next victims, Mr. and Mrs. Panagiatopoulou, were not lucky enough to get away with their lives or their home. Maryam told them that they would be cleared of all their sins if they joined her. Instead, she held them hostage and starved them until they put their property in Maryam's name. Maryam was not one to leave loose threads and decided that it would be best if the Panagiatopoulou would leave this world once and for all. Getting a TB diagnosis would set a death sentence in the early 1900s. Doctors could only lessen the patient's pain as they had no cure. Ms. Baca received her death sentence when she was told she had TB. When she heard the Convent of the Virgin was offering treatment for her disease, she was overjoyed. When she arrived at the monastery, she was expecting some type of spiritual treatment. She was horrified when the nuns took her to a cell and left her there. She wasn't given any medicines and was only fed a few tiny meals. Soon, Ms. Mihaliko began to get weaker. She suffered the same fate as many others under Miriam's ruthless supervision. She died alone in agony without a single loved one by her side. Not everyone living under Miriam's rule was happy with the way she conducted her business. Sister Theodote tried to speak out against the abbess's cruel method, but Miriam was not one to take this lightly. She accused Sister Theodote of misconduct and ordered that the nuns should be beaten as a punishment. The rest of the nuns had no choice but to follow the orders. They beat Sister Theodote until she suffered an internal hemorrhage. She died on the spot because of the intense beating and had paid her penance for disagreeing with the abbess. Anyone who tried to stand against Mother Rasputin would face her wrath. Sister Maria also spoke out against Miriam and was punished with a ruthless beating. When she arrived at the hospital, she was injured beyond recognition. She had internal bleeding with her vital organs damaged. The doctors tried to save her life, but no form of medical treatment can compensate for the brutality meted out by Miriam's. Sister Maria took her last breath and was finally released from the clutches of the Calendaris Church. The Calendaris Church denied that Miriam's had anything to do with the murders. However, there have been multiple witness statements that say otherwise. Miriam would lure innocent people into her monastery and promise them salvation. Instead, they would be tied up in a basement and forced to transfer all of their property to Miriam's name. Miriam was tried for 7 murders. Authorities estimated that she had killed at least 27 people by starvation, negligent homicides, and beatings in the name of penance. Religious figures hold authority over people. Miriam's crimes went undetected because no one believed that she could be capable of such villainy. Had she been an ordinary woman, things would have been completely different. As luck would have it, Miriam continued to send monks all across Greece to find wealthy spinsters, widows, and families. She would lure these innocent believers into donating to the monastery and steal the donations. One day, the police received an anonymous tip. The source informed the police that an elderly woman had donated all of her property to the monastery. The woman's daughter was certain that her mother would not have pledged the money without being forced. This accusation was not enough to put Miriam under arrest. The police started investigating Miriam's mysterious sources of wealth. They discovered that the abbess was involved in the illegal import of olive oil and other spices. However, the charge of illegal imports was not enough to arrest a high-profile figure like Miriam. After some time, a woman named Eugenia Margietta came forward stating that she was held in isolation by the monastery's abbess. She further alleged that she had been tortured to surrender her property worth $118 million, which was equivalent to $80,000 US at the time. In 1949, Christos Spyrides went to the Greek police searching for his daughter, Samila Spyrides, who went missing that year. The FBI traced Samila back to the monastery. The father of the 18-year-old girl said that he had been convinced by a nun named Miriam to give away property worth $10,000 US. He told the police that the nun had visited the United States to collect the property donated to the monastery. The Associated Press later revealed that Christos was reunited with his daughter. The police continued to investigate the allegations made against Miriam. They found out that the monastery practiced asceticism and did not allow any doctors to treat patients suffering from TB. Almost 150 people died due to the absence of medical treatment while they were staying at the monastery. As the investigation continued, the police discovered various victims who talked about the abbess who used to beat them, her small misdemeanors. She was in the habit of locking up her victims in solitary confinement. Those who survived revealed how Miriam used to stare at them until they would crumble and transfer their properties in her name. The news agency Reuters reported at the time of her arrest, Miriam had almost 300 homes and farms in her name. Moreover, she had collected gold and jewels worth thousands of pounds during her treacherous reign as Mother Rasputin. On the night of the 4th of December, 1950, when Miriam Zes was sound asleep in her magnificent chambers, the police entered the monastery. A total of 85 police officers searched the grounds of the monastery. They had anticipated the murders committed by Miriam and brought a deputy prosecutor, a judge, and a coroner with them. The operation lasted throughout the night. They rescued 36 children, The police had to physically grab the children from the hands of the nuns. According to the police, they were also rescued. Several half-naked, malnourished, and sick elderly women tied up in basements. The case of Mariam was extremely sensitive. The prosecutors were not sure whether they would be able to convict her on the charges of fraud and embezzlement. They began her trial under the charge of importing illegal olive oil and tires. However, the authority of the church would soon end. Mariam's worship, called the Matthewites, was outlawed in January 1951. The Archbishop Spiridon Vlachis of Athens and the Metropolitan Chrysostomus of Florina could not reconcile their differences. The old Kalandaris church was dismantled, and Mariam could not use religion as an excuse for heinous crimes. The public prosecutor was free to indict the ruthless nun, and he did not spare a single detail of her life of crime. He indicted her with all the crimes she had committed in the last 10 years, including homicide, fraud, and forgeries of wills, blackmail, and torture. Mariam continued to portray herself as a pious nun during her trials. She wore an Orthodox icon honoring the late Matthew, ordaining him with the name Saint Matthew, the new confessor. She rejected all charges against her, calling them satanic fictions. Maybe Mariam had convinced herself that everything she had done was in the name of religion. You could say that Mariam had brought back the Salem witch trials where innocent people were aimed to death to let the church take over their property. She stood in the courtroom like a cold, heartless monster whose only aim was to satisfy her own greed. As she heard the charges brought against her, she would cross herself and make a prayer of vengeance to St. Matthew. She knew that she did not have any defense, no matter what legal loophole she tried to use. The defense attorney said that people who came into the monastery would take a vow of property. They would hand over all of their property to the monastery of their own free will. He claimed that the property was transferred to Mariam's name because the monastery did not have a legal setup. The enormity of Mariam's crimes resulted in 3 separate trials. The first trial was conducted in the years 1951 and 1952. The second one continued into 1953, and the third and last trial was concluded a few months before her death. She was convicted for 26 months after her first trial, 10 years after the second trial, and 4 consecutive months in her last trial. Mariam's sentence in 1951 came as a shock to Matthewites all across Greece. They held a rally to liberate their leader from the clutches of the legal system. They demanded that she should be released and returned to her rightful place. The police had to protect the archbishop. There was a dangerous possibility of the Clanries kidnapping the archbishop and demanding Mariam's release from prison. Mariam SOULAKIOTIS was incarcerated in the Avrov prison located on Alexander's Avenue in Athens. She spent the last part of her life as isolated as her victims, but she did not suffer the same end. The total length of her sentence was 14 years, but she only spent a year or so in prison before she fell ill. She was rushed to the hospital where she died at the age of 71. SOULAKIOTIS had more than 400 followers when she was in power. Almost 500 people gave away their property to the monastery by drafting a will in Mariam's name. The same number of people died in the monastery due to disease, starvation, or torture. The Matthewites nurses continued to pray for the intercession of Holy Mariam, as they thought she was the model of purity and piety. They continued to thrive under new leadership. No one knows who took over from the formidable Mariam SOULAKIOTIS. The woman who continued would vanish without a trace. They were adept at hiding their identity as well as their location. They revered Mariam SOULAKIOTIS as their true saint and claimed that the male priests and monks were jealous of Mariam's success. When asked about the hundreds of deaths in the monastery, the Matthewites explained that the people who joined the church were already very old. The fact that they died was God's will rather than Mariam's negligence. Mariam SOULAKIOTIS left a deep mark on the pages of history. Many Greek writers have explored the life of the ruthless murderer who hid behind the veil of fate. Nina Koulataki explains the vindictive nature of the Abbas in her book, Murderesis, published in 2019, by saying, "It is only by happenstance that the monastery used the old Julian calendar rather than its revised form. Only a cunning, shrewd Abbas like SOULAKIOTIS would have had equal success regardless of her brand of Greek Orthodox Christianity." Carrie Seatrave, who wrote an exhaustive account of Mariam SOULAKIOTIS in her book, Woman, Serial and Mass Murderers, stated that the prosecutors estimated the total number of victims as 177. At the end of the day, the story of Mariam SOULAKIOTIS is a story of faith. However, the overwhelming evidence stirs the faith of those who believe in humanity. The brutality with which Miriam ruled her monastery does not leave much to the imagination. She used everything in her power to amass as much wealth as she could. As we conclude the chilling tale of Miriam SOULAKIOTIS, the notorious serial killer cloaked in the guise of a pious nun, we are reminded of the depths to which human depravity can sink. Despite her facade of religious devotion, Miriam's insatiable greed and thirst for power led her down a path of unimaginable cruelty and destruction. Her heinous crimes shocked a nation and left a legacy of terror in their wake. But let us also remember the resilience of the human spirit, as survivors sought justice and communities rallied against her tyranny. As we reflect on this dark chapter of history, let us pledge to remain vigilant against such evil, and to uphold the values of compassion and justice. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to like and subscribe for more riveting tales on all things scary.